Hi, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Where should your fantasy begin? Now, in your mind's eye, your favourite fantasy fiction novel almost certainly started in a familiar, home-like place. For example, the suburban surroundings of Little Whinging in Surrey, England, or the affable rurality of Hobbiton in West Farthing, or the safety of the darling's bedroom in an affluent area of London, or sitting on a riverbank enjoying a lazy picnic, or helping a much-loved uncle and aunt on their homestead, or occupying a comfortable cottage with just one spare room. In your memory, a hero's journey always starts in what we might term a place of comfort. And this is because the main character must leave their place of comfort to begin a journey that will take him or her or it into an unfamiliar realm to battle demons and monsters, not necessarily literally by the way, but certainly metaphorically, before getting any chance of returning to their familiar place of comfort, except of course by the time they return they will be thoroughly changed by their experience. I'm in no doubt you'll want to correct me on those assertions. You'll be eager to tell me that your favourite fantasy fiction started with a piece of action, rather like a hook, and you'll insist that it was this action bit that lured you into the storybook in the first place. And that's a fair comment, I suppose, and I apologise. And I especially apologise if you thought I was advising you to publish your book without an action scene at the start. I wasn't advising that. What I'm advising is writing your book from the beginning in a familiar place of comfort. Because that's what I'm discussing here. I'm discussing your earliest chapter, or your earliest chapters, once you've gone past your piece of action. This is where to start your writing, and this is where to start your journey with your main character. And by the way, unless you're an award-winning novelist with tons of books behind you, I might suggest that you start writing your stunning introductory action scene a little bit later on anyway. And when you've become accustomed to your own writing, as well as perhaps more closely acquainted with the quirks and the habits and the spontaneous idiosyncrasies of your character. Because at this stage you don't even know them. At this stage you haven't even been introduced to them properly, and your characters don't know you. And by the way, the action scene bit that you're referring to, that was the hook that lured you into the stories that you like, is technically known in the trade as in media res, or in media res, which is Latin for in the middle of things. And it will require, of course, later explanations and expositions and flashbacks for your reader to understand it. And that's why it's best to tackle later in the development of your project. So the in media res bit is actually a little bit more like a teaser. And that's because those little kickstart action scenes, the little bits of action just to kickstart a story, don't build any actual tension. They are hooks. And they don't scrutinise a character in depth, obviously, apart from reviewing how they might act in a fight or flight situation. And even if you insist on writing your little bit of action right away, and I can't stop you, And in fact, I'm rather glad that you want to try if that's what you want to do. It's good to see that you've got an independent, eccentric streak. And it will make things a lot easier later on, you'll see. But even if you do want to start with that, I tentatively suggest that you cushion your reader straight after it with a homely domestic scene. Because this is taking the long-term view. Your story will be all about easing your reader into the hostility and the struggle and the conflict that will come later. So, after a short, snappy in media res, which I'd humbly suggest that you write later, but it's up to you, let your readers kick back, snuggle down, sigh with delight, and smile to themselves as they move gently and elegantly into the riveting journey that you have laid out for them. They'll need to make themselves very comfortable, by the way, because it will be a very long haul. So, what is liminality? It's something that I think is crucial for your understanding of fantasy and also your understanding of kickstarting your fantasy journey. And I want you to be inventive. I want you to be an inventive fantasy fiction writer because I think that's your job. I think our job as fantasy fiction writers is to be constantly thinking outside the box. And so that's why I'm going to venture to suggest liminality at such an early stage. And I know it's a difficult concept to grasp, but I also know that it's going to be fine with you. And how do I know that? Well, I know it because you're a fantasy fiction fan, so therefore you're good at doing a bit of lateral thinking, aren't you? So I'm sure that liminality will be a piece of cake for you. In psychology and in psychophysics, a limen or limen is a sensory threshold. We all know that we can only see things within a certain range, i.e. near and far, light and dark, and all this within just a portion of the available electromagnetic spectrum. We know, for example, that we can't see microwaves, and yet they form part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And we can't see radio waves, even though they are merely light, and they can be detected by our electronic equipment. We can't see them with our eyes. And that's because radio waves and microwaves and other waves are outside our human recognition threshold. And that's the level at which a stimulus can be detected and recognised by a human. Taking this concept a little further, we know we can't see infrared light, but snakes, to take one example, can. And we can't see ultraviolet light either, but shrimps and many other insects use ultraviolet wavelengths to see. So we know that some creatures can operate outside our human range, and that is, they can operate outside our recognition threshold. Similarly, take our sense of hearing. Our recognition threshold for sound is actually quite small. And worse news still, the human ear is not equally sensitive to all sound frequencies. So we do know, and it's common knowledge, that dogs can hear things that we can't. And bats, for example, they use ultrasonic sound to hunt their prey. Once again, these creatures, dogs and bats and possibly all other creatures, operate outside our human sensory range for sound, and that is, in other words, outside our recognition threshold. Well, what does all this mean to a fantasy fiction fan who wants to write a book? It means that other dimensions are lying out there quite amazingly close by, and you will want your hero to visit those other dimensions, won't you? Isn't that what fantasy is all about? Your main character may not have to travel very far to get to the next place. Why? Because the next place is probably right there, right by their elbow, right by your elbow too. I like to think that the awareness of this other world is closer than everybody supposes. And just because you can't see it and hear it, just because you can't sense it, it doesn't mean it's not there. And I haven't finished yet. There's more. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, who I've covered in depth at the beginning of this year. Anyway, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans believed that there were spirits and deities who hovered around, if you like, above and in the vicinity of thresholds and gates and over doorways to protect them. These spirits and these deities were known as liminal spirits. In fact, the Latin limen, which I mentioned earlier, just means threshold. And so these spirit, which were kind of supernatural, invisible characters, people like Iris and Persephone, they stood guard over the most important thresholds. And these are the thresholds that lead to other dimensions. In other words, people like Iris and Persephone and these other liminal spirits, they guard the doors to the other world. The Romans even had specifically put aside a god for door handles and door hinges. And if you wanted to know her name was Cardia. Now, if you are a strict Christian, then it's possible you might be disconcerted or even troubled by this mention of pagan gods who look after the thresholds. But I remind you that in Christian tradition, it has it that Saint Peter holds the keys to heaven, and doesn't he protect the pearly gates? So even in Christian tradition, there's a saint, the most important saint in the church, really, who's a liminal spirit. Okay, you ask, so where's all this going? You've reminded me that I can't see as brilliantly as a snake. You've reminded me I can't hear as well as a bat. You've reminded me I'm ignorant about some ancient baloney about weirdo ghosts who hover around doorknobs, etc. So what? Well, next, I want to introduce you to crossover. You see, going back to the science of liminality, and this is science, by the way, it's not religion, just so you know, the pioneers who studied the subject of sensory thresholds observed that although there might be an upper and a lower absolute level of human sensory perception, in other words, these are the limits beyond which a stimulus can no longer be detected, some people have better sub-thresholds and others have better supra-thresholds for the detection of stimuli. And these events are known as phenomena. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is a handful of people can see things or hear things or taste things or feel things. They can sense things that others cannot. And also in the science experiments, they found that ordinary non-phenomenal humans, so in other words, you and I, we had good days and we had bad days. So a test subject might hear or see something one day, but then on the very next day could not accurately see or hear it, and so on. The day afterwards, they might see it better than ever before. So when you hear your granny say, "My eyes are terrible today," it's true. Her eyes may well be less effective on one day than they are on another. That's how human senses work. And what's crazier still is that scientists also discovered that the age of a human might affect their perception. So I've got a good example of that. I can't hear the high-pitched sounds of our cooker timer in our kitchen anymore, although I could when I first got it. And youths, they hear a load more sounds than adults. And also the gender of a human affects sensory perception, because my wife hears our cooker timer and she kicks me to say the timer's going, even though she's about my age. And nerve damage also affects sensory perception. I worked in a very loud environment for much of my life, so maybe that's why I can't hear our cooking timer, because my hearing sensory perception has been damaged. And similarly, psychological factors will affect sensory perception. So, for example, the current mental state of a human, or their memory faculty generally, or any drugs they've been taking or medicines, any fatigue or any mental stresses they might be enduring, or even their hormonal state and even their mood will all factor into it. All these things will alter a person's sensory perception. The crossover point is what I want to turn to next. I suggest that at some point in time and space, perhaps just 1 minute in every day, or 1 second in 100 living hours, or just the occasional period in a very long lifetime, for example, an afternoon in 50 years, we reach the crossover point. This is the moment when we go past liminal and we travel, or we attempt to travel into the otherworld. This crossover event might be at a topographic place, in other words, at a special place or in a special location, or it might be at a specific moment in one's life, or it might be a combination of both. Aha, I hear you say, as the penny softly drops. Is that why churches are guarded by gargoyles and threshold bosses? Are they liminal spirits? Is it because when people enter a sacred place like a church, maybe for a religious ceremony like a wedding or a funeral, they are about to attempt, or they feel that they're going to attempt, a crossover into another world? And is that why such places are guarded by liminal spirits? And is that why, going back to your old school, for example, visiting an old classroom that you haven't been in since you were aged 5, or visiting the old house that you grew up in, is that why they feel kind of strange? Is it because it's on the liminal end of things? And is that also why All Hallows Eve, or Halloween to you and I, is celebrated around the world? Is it because that time of the year there's a sense of liminality in the air? It's when light gives way to darkness and autumn gives way to winter, and so life gives sway to death. And that's why the festival has pre-Christian pagan roots, by the way. And I don't want to go into it right now. I have covered Halloween before. But it's long been held that the season of All Hallowtide is a weird period of liminality. It's a period when creatures, perhaps creatures from the other world, find they are able to cross over the normally protected barriers, those thresholds. They can cross over and invade our dimension, even if it's only for a minute or a few hours. And I want to turn to rites of passage, and you'll see how all this will merge together and make one argument. We have all experienced rites of passage, curious experiences like high school proms and college graduation ceremonies and joining rituals for clubs or societies or sports team, or, for many of us, sacred rituals that involved joining a religious community, are all rites of passage. And there's lots of other mundane things too that will count as a rite of passage. The first day in a new school, moving to a new house, the first day in a new job, the first day at summer camp, or the first day moving to a new city, or a first day of holiday without parents, or a first kiss, or going up to the big school from the little school, and many other curious experiences that can be described as the rites of passage. And if you speak to anybody about this, or if you just think about your own experiences, you'll know that your very first time, or your very first day, the rites of passage moment was weird. It felt weird. If you ask anybody about their rites of passage, they'll tell you that they felt out of place. They'll say that they felt as if they didn't belong. And if you know somebody who's going through a rite of passage right now, they'll probably tell you that they wish they'd never started the journey in the first place. But talk with them a month from now, and you'll believe in your heart of hearts that there was never a problem in the first place. There was never any doubt in their mind. So rites of passage come in 3 phases. I just want to go through those with you. First, there's the separation phase, and that's when a person leaves their comfort zone to start a new adventure. And at this stage, there's a sense of clinging on to the old order, not wanting to go forward, and the anxiety and distress caused by homesickness. Then there is the transition phase, and this is when a person tries hard to transition from one state to another. So it brings a sense of floundering and an over-trying and of working hard to adapt, to fit in. And finally, if the changeover and the conversion is successful, the person will enter the acceptance phase. Because they'll be accepted by their new tribe, they'll take on their new role, and they'll even perhaps become a new person as a result. For example, they often have their title or their, if you like, character changed. They might be called an adult straight afterwards, or a graduate, or a high schooler, or a convert, or a qualified worker. In fact, that phase is also known as incorporation because you become part of the new body. Can you relate to that? Can you relate to those experiences? And I want to tell you that the bit in the rite of passage, the bit in the middle of those three phases, which I just called a transition phase, isn't called a transition phase, but I specifically put those words in to put you off the scent a bit. But now I can bring you back, and I can bring the whole of my argument back. In fact, the middle bit of that, remember the middle bit of that? The transitioning bit where a person tries hard to transition from one state to another, and they have a sense of floundering and overtrying and of working hard to fit in. That phase is actually called the liminality phase. There's that sneaky word again, liminality, threshold. So here's the thing. When people are on the edge, are they on the edge of a rite of passage? Their sensory thresholds might be temporarily suspended, or their sensory thresholds might, the opposite way around, be intensified. At those rare moments in life, all humans might be highly sensitive and especially attuned to stimuli that might be normally outside their usual sensory thresholds. Do you remember I said earlier that you get good days with your senses and you get bad days with your senses? And when you're on the edge of a rite of passage, your senses could be especially highly sensitive. What I'm suggesting here is that people's senses might be enhanced at the moment of intense change. But of course the downside is they also will be vulnerable at that moment. So if you think of Harry Potter, he's in a liminal state for much of the story. He starts with living with the Dursley family, which is strange to him. He starts in a new school, which is strange to him. Almost every single book is about him going up a year, which is strange for him, going into the next level. He joins the Quidditch team, which is strange for him. He has his first kiss, etc., etc. So he's in a constant state of liminality. Luke Skywalker is on the edge of adulthood, and he's emerging from adolescence when he's lured into an adventure by a secret message that was sent by Princess Leia. So he's at the point of liminality. He's on the edge of his rite of passage. The Pevensey children, the Pevensey family in the Larn, the Witch and the Wardrobe, have just been evacuated from their family home in London to escape the bombing of the Blitz. So it's a time of change and stress for them. They're going through a rite of passage. They're already on the state of liminality, and that's even before they find the magic wardrobe and to make their classic crossover from this dimension, our dimension, to the other world. Remember, right at the start I said that the awareness of the other world is closer than you might suppose. It might be just at the edge of your elbow. And take the orphan Frodo. He comes of age, which incidentally is a universally accepted rite of passage, if ever there was one, just as his adopted guardian, the hobbit Bilbo, leaves the Shire for good. So Frodo is certainly on the edge of liminality as well. Do you see? Wherever you set your opening, and like I've already suggested, you might want to work on your action piece a little bit later on, but wherever you set it, I recommend you start somewhere cosy, somewhere that you can lull your audience into a false sense of security. But by doing this, you'll ensure that they'll start to explore the freaky nature and the rather fantastic state of liminality. And that's how to add magic and mystery right from the very start. Any rite of passage could trigger it, by the way. So you don't have to go by the ones which have been written in the past. Think about things which are perhaps more modern. The separation of a child's parents, that would cause a rite of passage. The separation from a primary caregiver. Financial catastrophe. War. Famine. Forced migration. A change of school. Accepting the consequences of a debilitating chronic illness. Starting a job. Getting married. All these situations will bring about liminality, and they'll bring about a crossover quickly, neatly, and appropriately. I mean, you might ask, what if my main character is already in another world? So what I suppose you mean is Frodo or Skywalker are already inside another world. Yes, it's true, those characters already inhabit an other world, but they still have to move from one threshold to another threshold within their dimension, do you see? It's a bit like crossing the ice wall from Westeros to the land beyond the wall. But if you're quite sure that your character will not make a crossover of any kind, then I imagine you won't be using the hero's journey template anyway for your fantasy fiction narrative. And that's fine by me as well. And in fact, I'm totally at peace with it. Good for you. There you go again, being an independent thinker. Though you might want to check other plot types or other narrative structures that I've covered. And I'm willing to bet a little side bet that you'll encounter some kind of liminality and a crossover point sooner or later in your story. So hopefully this hasn't been a complete waste of time for you. But yeah, where should your fantasy begin? It should begin in a home-like, comfy, familiar place, and there should be an element of liminality before a rite of passage. Good luck. Let me know how you get on.